Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Brian Nam-Sonenstein, who is a publishing editor for Shadowproof and also the co-host of the Beyond Prisons podcast with Kim Wilson. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Kevin. Wonderful way to start the day talking to you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, and thanks for making some time. So there's a little bit of a backstory to this episode, which we don't really have to get into, but it is worth noting that you're graciously, stepping up to give me some time to provide people an introduction into the issue of prison censorship.
Yep.
And I'll ask you what you think we mean by that and
Sure.
what we're talking about when we say prison censorship in a moment. But you recommended some people. We won't name them out of respect. And I reached out and asked people at these organizations, and I got varying answers. And of three people I tried, it just seemed like neither of them were confident in being guests on the show this week to talk about this topic, which I know to you illustrated this weird dynamic of this is one of the most intense problems within prisons for those who are incarcerated. Maybe it's not necessarily a life and death issue, although it could be. Could be, but we're not necessarily talking about healthcare.
Yeah.
We're not talking about people being raped or sexually assaulted and it going ignored. But at the same time, like the loss of communication, of freedom of speech is something that is an intense problem. So, and having laid that basic context, when you hear the idea of prison censorship, what are we talking about? And I know you believe it's one of the biggest freedom of speech issues in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, where to begin? I mean, I think just sort of zoomed out when we're talking about free speech in the United States. Obviously, if we're talking about like the First Amendment and so on and so forth, this really targeted to the government suppression of speech, right? And a lot of what I feel like gets talked about in the media, and not necessarily that it shouldn't be talked about, but a lot of it's focused on like social media platforms or speaking at college, college campuses and things like that. But particularly on the left, I just find it so bizarre because censorship and the stifling of freedom of speech is fundamental bedrock aspect of incarceration in the United States. And I'm not just talking about, for example, banning books or even just banning letters, but we're also talking about the disenfranchisement of voters. We're talking about the coercion that exists around everyday life and communications on the phone. And insofar as the First Amendment, I think, enshrines the ability to organize in this country, there's no place in which the state has a tighter grip on demobilizing and suppressing organizing than in the prison. And I think what also just makes it even more bizarre that this is left out of the conversation is that there's almost unlimited impunity that these organizations have, right? Like you can talk all day about how, there are legal protections and constitutional guarantees for people in prison and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, none of that really matters in practice. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter, but the fact of the matter is that unless people are actively paying attention, unless people are pressuring corrections departments and so on and so forth, these issues persist, and the stifling of speech and organizing is suppressed in every arbitrary way you can imagine. So I think the last thing I'll just say to set this up is that, again, I would encourage us to think about speech in the same expansive way that we think about it on the outside, right? And how much we might take for granted even just the basic kinds of speech within our families, not even, in terms of getting up on a podium and giving a political talk. These things are routinely and systematically controlled, suppressed, and stifled. Profit is extracted from them. And again, at the end of the day, I think that people miss that prisons are important sites of organizing. They're places where people every day organize and band together for their own survival. And so when we're talking about stifling speech, it is in that context. It's not just people sitting around, like lumps on a log. So yeah, I thought maybe that was a good place to start us off.
Yeah, that's really good. And so in preparing for the show, I came up with a few examples, and I think you're right that when we hear prison censorship, one of the first things we know, and it's because I think it's accessible for the
Yeah.
media. It's a really tangible way for the media to cover to say these books are not being allowed into prisons.
Yep.
That is something that you don't have to do a lot of work to put together that story and to communicate to people that this is wrong. And typically uh, people aren't going to disagree that certain individuals should have access to literature. And also like I know that there are struggles within prisons, but it's mostly been agreed upon in our history that incarcerated individuals have access to a law library so that they can
Oh my God.
read the materials. But that's not always the case that they
Right.
get to be in that library. But in any case, so one of the more vivid examples of the last few years is one that I followed involving the book that was done by Heather Ann Thompson
Yeah.
on Attica's uprising called Blood in the Water. Recently, it was restored minus 2 pages because there's maps. This happened in New York State. There was a lawsuit in Illinois against the Illinois Department of Corrections for not allowing that book in. That's an example. But if we pull back and we're not just like hyper focused on one particular book, I do note that those who have worked on sending books to prisons note that a lot of times the censorship is targeted to Black authors
Yeah.
or Black novels, Black historical nonfiction, Black political, Black sociology, anything that
Yeah.
could give. And the thing that is communicated on this that I find to be really salient for our conversation is that anything that could awaken the conscience of any person who is incarcerated, help explain what is going on around them. That is something that has to be shut down typically by those who are empowered to be censors. So I'll just throw in,
Yeah.
and then you can respond to all of this because I believe there's a connective tissue to everything here.
Yeah.
That the Human Rights Defense Center does prison legal news and sends it into prisons, and that is a digest of news items related to prisons and jails throughout the United States, and also I think prosecutors as well.
Yeah.
And so knowing what is happening and that it's not just your prison that is oppressing you, but it is all prisons and jails, that is something that is like wardens don't want to allow in their facility.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking about what you just said, I think one of the things maybe that listeners of this show might appreciate, just based on a lot of what your work focuses on, Kevin, is that the same sorts of justifications, the same sort of hearkening to issues of security and safety writ large and extremely broadly are always the sort of pat justification that the prison is going to use. Even in South Carolina, Shadowproof articles are banned from prisons in South Carolina. And you can get down to the reasoning, you can get down into the weeds and moralize about particular books and, maps and books and things like that. But at the end of the day, they can say whatever they want as a reason. And a lot of times they don't even give, a reason to ban these things or to block them. Certainly when books like Heather Ann Thompson's, which is very visible and widely known, gets banned, there's an ability to organize around it. They know what it is. And, there might be an exception made for that book, but there is so much more that just on a daily basis gets blocked. And it's not even necessarily like a formal block. Like, even the idea that people would be sort of put through a process where you're getting a rejection letter. I have people who just receive torn envelopes, who just get like a piece of a torn envelope delivered to their cell or delivered to the person on the other side. And I think this gets to the next point that I wanted to make in particular, that these facilities, they are part of a larger Department of Corrections, right? Like they do sort of fit into a hierarchy. They have rules and regulations from the top down, but the mail rooms and the wardens in each particular place have an insane amount of control and latitude to do whatever they want. And almost never does that get challenged, not even legally, not through public pressure. So I wanted to point that out as well. And then the other thing I would say is that on the subject of like what gets censored, I think you're absolutely right when it comes to a lot of Black liberation literature and things like that. Absolutely gets censored. It's also, I think, important to note that a lot of like a lot of incarcerated people use zines, for example, as a means to communicate between facilities, right? Because as an incarcerated person, you can't really like call another prison and talk to somebody, like there's no receiving a phone call in prison. So in order for people to coordinate and not even just coordinate, but to feel connected to other people in their plight, there's all kinds of smaller zines that, don't have an online presence. They don't get talked about in media. There's a whole world of things that I want your listeners to understand that exist out there that they don't see. And these things are routinely suppressed in the name of security. And, we could do an entire day worth of content on the absurdity of these. I know in the past, Shadowproof has written about how news articles written by prisoners and prisoner advocacy groups about white supremacist movements, under the Trump administration, which were not favorable. They were critiques and articles about the harm and the violence, were given designations as like promoting white supremacy or racial tension by the prison, and were blocked for those reasons. So, it serves a lot of purposes, like I said, right? It's both a means to just be cruel and just to harm people. Sometimes, which we can get into separately, sometimes it's a means to make money if they're outsourcing it to another company and that company's processing the mail and they're getting a kickback, blah, blah, blah. But again, importantly, I need folks to understand that this is also demobilizing. It's chilling. It also harms the ability for people who are trying to organize to communicate with each other. There is a very real political consequence to this.
And also with the change or proliferation in technology, I know you followed the loss of physical mail.
Yes.
And so this is a point where we can shift to incarcerated writers.
Yeah.
We can, but also recognize that not everyone's a writer. Some are just writing to their family, friends, and others they want to remain connected to on the outside. And the possibility that they may not ever physically hold what they're receiving is one aspect, but then also the possibility that they might not be able to get out, which is the more obvious one, that they won't be able to send what they've written, is another aspect.
Yeah. And to this point, I think people also need to understand that we have an enormous amount of research, and I think just basic common sense, that being able to maintain a personal connection to your loved ones is essential to you being able to get out of prison and being able to exist after prison in a society and not get dragged back in. You can't do this stuff alone. It's very hard for families already to stay in touch. Being in prison is extremely expensive. You are nickeled and dimed at every moment. Most of the time, it's women who have to do this work and who are taking care of children and also supporting loved ones on the inside. Legal fees. I mean, it's a mountain of stuff. And what we've seen, over the last few years is sort of this, there's a burgeoning movement, I think, I can't say like geographically specific to Silicon Valley, but in like the tech world, to try and get into prisons and provide services one way or another. Some of this is through like surveillance and, disgusting stuff like being able to, pipe in pepper spray, through like sprinklers through the top. It's like all kinds of stuff. But one of the most insidious places that these tech companies have gotten involved pertains to mail and visitation, both of which obviously are free speech issues. To what you're discussing, in places like Delaware, Pennsylvania, other places around the country, you now have to send your mail to Florida, for example, in order to get your mail to Delaware. Because in Florida, they're going to check and make sure that, the article, the thing you're sending is the right size, that it's the right material, blah, blah, blah. And then they're going to photocopy it, which they say is like a high quality reproduction. And then they're going to deliver it digitally or a printout to the incarcerated person. Now, again, I think it's very easy for people to say, well, we don't know what kind of contraband is being, what if that letter is soaked in fentanyl or something like that? This is all propaganda. I mean, this is like, again, for your listeners who are, maybe more attuned to issues of global imperialism and military propaganda around safety and security, these are the same lessons brought home to roost in the United States. Most of the contraband that enters into prisons does so either through the literal hands of the guards or through supervision of the guards. None of this stuff gets through without at least one or a couple corrections officers knowing about it. And so at the end of the day, what you're doing is you are just creating more obstacles to keep people in touch, because the prison knows that is what will keep more people in the prison. If you if your child sends you a card that gets banned and rejected because it has glitter on it, or because it used some crayon, that they're skeptical of, that's not just a matter of like an inconvenience of not receiving a card. That is deeply traumatizing. That impacts the ability of a child to build a connection with a parent on the inside. In an incredible number of people who are incarcerated have a child on the other side. And I just, it's just maddening. And then it's the same thing with visitation, right? I think COVID has helped facilitate a lot of this and sped it up a lot, where, it started before COVID, where like we started to see video visitation creep in. Some jails started to try going to, full video visitation, which costs money and, has all kinds of tech problems and assumes all kinds of technological and time capabilities that people have. Visiting in person is already terrible, but it also introduces a whole new level of surveillance. It also introduces a whole new revenue stream. It is just absolutely disgusting. And again, these things are fundamental to the prison. They're characterized as security issues, and yet whenever we talk about free speech, it's not even on the radar.
And so I noticed in putting together the show, and again, we're just laying out a kind of basic foundation. And for those who follow and listen to the show, in the future, I'm going to have people come on and talk about things in more specific sections of this, because I do find this to be such it has a lot of synergy with the stuff that I have covered historically speaking. It's easy to look at what's going on with prison censorship and connect it to my coverage of whistleblowers, especially when somebody like CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou, who we supported at Fire Dog Lake, was writing letters from Loretto prison that were going through the censors and dealing with risk of retaliation. I even have a letter that I never published because John was able to get to me a personal request to like, don't post that. I'm afraid I'm going to be impacted negatively if it is. So we're going to hold off and not publish that. We don't need to anymore, because I talk about a particular correctional officer and we're past that, and I don't want the risks. So in any case, there are these prison book programs. There are programs that people have come together to develop. I also noticed that there's a movement to have nonprofit organizations or other groups that focus on this like idea of the right to write from prison. Maybe you want to say a little bit about some of the positive aspects. I will say that before I did this show, I was surprised that as I was looking through just Google News to see recent developments, that apparently Pen America had done a spread on book censorship in prisons and also just other forms of censorship, and had a widespread number of articles. Like they did 4 or 5 different articles as if they were putting together a magazine, and we're doing it from an abolitionist perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a few things. Just quickly touching on what you were saying at the beginning about the letter from John and that whole dynamic. I think one of the things that I want to underscore is that part of the reason why maybe you don't see as much visible organizing, like, yes, I think what you're describing with Penn and some of these other organizing are positive developments. There's also the Prison Journalism Project. There's Empowerment Avenue, who we have worked with and are currently working with for Marvel Cook. To get incarcerated journalists' work published. There's a lot of movement happening here. There's a lot of stuff that we don't see, again, because it's happening on a family and community level. These are not people with Twitter accounts. These are not people with websites. They don't have they don't even have names for their organizations, right? This is much more organic. And I think part of what we need to understand about how serious this is and how it's not just a matter of a policy here and there is that a lot of people are reluctant to really make too much noise about this because the threat of retaliation is severe, and it is not just like a slap on the wrist. You can go to the hole for a year. You can be put in solitary confinement on a trumped up charge that is completely made up or fabricated, or and you could be put in solitary for a year, and then you're really not going to communicate with anybody, or you're really going to have that abridged. So I just only to say that the retaliation aspect of this and the chilling effect that has on organizing, I cannot emphasize enough. But yes, as for the positive developments, there has definitely been particularly, I think, since the prison strikes around 2018, 2019, or 2016, 2019, if I'm getting my dates correct, I think that those helped create a lot of the sort of organizational relationships with people on the inside to facilitate programs like this, because it takes a lot of support for an incarcerated journalist to write, right? Like they can't just write an article and then email it to me or whatever. Some people have access to email. Some people that I've worked with can only receive email and then they have to send me snail mail. Like there is so much support that's needed. You need people who are around to pick up phone calls at random hours because you can't schedule that stuff. So it is very encouraging to see more energy around this, more organizing capacity, and I highly support that work. If I were to have any criticism about it is, maybe it's a separate issue somewhat from free speech, but a lot of times what we see in terms of opportunities for incarcerated people to publish, it's always very narrow, right? Like incarcerated people, we are taught that they're liars, basically. We can't trust what they say. We shouldn't trust them or believe that they're educated or capable of having an analysis or things like that. I know that I have heard time and time again that incarcerated people will pitch stories to outlets, and the outlets will be like, well, actually, we really just want you to talk about, the abuse that you're facing or your case and in the injustice of it. We don't really want to hear your analysis on COVID, or we don't really want to hear what you have to say about sentencing, or those kinds of things. And I think that in its own way is a prejudicial way of also stifling the speech of these people, because again, the conditions that they are in, there is a desperation to be able to get the foot in the door and to do this. And I just know that so many people have put their own trauma on the line to tell these stories and are still pigeonholed into sort of what they're allowed to talk about and not. So it's complicated, but I am very grateful that people are taking it more seriously. I'm super grateful for people like Mariam Kaba, who have helped us sort of pay incarcerated writers. I think that this is another thing, just really quickly, that I wanted to call out, is the fact that there's laws on the books all over the place that prevent incarcerated people either from giving speeches or accepting money, under the guise that it could cause harm to their victims. I don't want to minimize the experiences of people who encountered violence at all. I do think that the problem here is that is the prison, right? Like the fact of the matter is that the prison is getting in the way of any kind of healing or transformation or any sort of ability to deal with harm. And so what we have instead is just this sort of ham-fisted attempt to take away people's ability to not only speak but to take care of themselves. Like I said, it's very expensive. Somebody like Mumia Abu-Jamal, trying to give speeches either about his own experience or his case or just prison issues at large is constantly under attack from the victim's family, the police officer's family, in his case. And so yeah, those are some of the things that come to mind on what you said. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, those are all really important details. So as we wind down here, I got to get you out of here. Uh, Everyone should know that we do this Marvel Cook Fellowship over at Shadowproof, which
Yep.
does give a platform for incarcerated writers, and is a place that you can go to read some perspectives from journalists. They're not. There have been some people that you've been able to get who are incarcerated. There's others who are not, and then
Yep.
they're representing some very important issues and speaking on topics that are under attended to when it comes to the independent media, particularly. So I think a good point to end on. Well, this is one more quick plug. You and I now co-host a call-in show called The Reframe, and people should go to callin.com, look up The Reframe, find it, follow our show. We're supposed to do a show together next week. I'm not quite sure what it'll be on, but
We'll figure it out.
I'll just tease. I don't know that it really will, but I'll just tease that something that caught my attention that Brian and you might be able to help me speak on next week is people using Twitter to try to have conversations about prison abolition in bad faith, and whether that's even appropriate to try and attempt to do because of how much bigotry and prejudice is built into our politics that you have to be able to dismantle, and you can't do it through social media necessarily. That aside, the last thing I have for you is this censorship is so intrinsic to the prisons that I wanted to note that people who have been involved in prison book programs, I was seeing this, that one person's account that I read, they mentioned it turned them into an abolitionist based upon the problems that they had observed and experienced in trying to send books to prisons. I think that's a good point to end on.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that you did that, because I think it ties to sort of what I wanted to end on as well, which is that I think the biggest, if you're wondering like, well, what the fuck do we do about this? I think solidarity in its most basic form is necessary here. Like, we need to, particularly journalists, like I'm speaking to everybody, but journalists, I think that we need to not just reach out to prisoners and treat them as an avenue to do our work. We need to actually form relationships of power with incarcerated people so that not only are we, quote unquote, bearing witness to what happens, but we are at their side to fight through it. Because if we allow sort of the distance to exist between journalists or people on the outside and people on the inside, that space is where all of this stuff is allowed to thrive, is allowed to evolve and gain steam. It allows organized forces of law enforcement to make all kinds of ridiculous propagandistic claims about contraband and safety and blah, blah, blah. We need to form actual friendships and relationships with people who are on the inside. And I agree, it is a radicalizing experience. And that doesn't mean that every prisoner that you're going to speak to is an abolitionist. Far from it. But I think the experience of sort of the quotidian, just petty, violent, again, not even talking about like beatings, abuse, that stuff is all very real and serious. And there is a place to talk about that. I'm talking about, again, getting a torn envelope with just the stamp delivered to your cell. That is a message. And I think the only way we can really overcome it, the only thing that the prison will cow to is when they have folks on the outside who are committed, who are, actually interested in pushing back. And so I think solidarity really is the core of building this community here.
Yeah, and it also can get in between intimacy between you
Yes.
and your relative, your family, your friend. They could take a photo and sexualize it and make it seem like something that it's not, and then you're not even able to like have that connection
Yeah.
with a person on a level that we all identify with from what we do on Facebook or how we share our own experiences with each
Yeah.
other on the outside.
Women are routinely banned. They'll drive for hours to attend a visitation only to be turned away because the collar on their shirt is like a centimeter too low. I mean, again, there's ways to look at these through all kinds of lenses, but the censorship lens, in terms of our ability to communicate with each other, we need to start seeing that more.
Yeah. I mean, that's striking because it's a censorship of the senses. It's not
Right.
just like
Yeah.
reading it's also like what you hear and what you're able to feel.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Unauthorized Disclosure, Brian. Again, you are the co-host of Beyond Prisons and also a publishing editor with me over at Shadowproof. So thanks again, Brian.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and thanks for giving space to this conversation. I appreciate it.
So thank you for tuning in to the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'll just put up the link where you can go to subscribe. Typically, I have a co-host, Rania Kalik, and some weeks it'll be just me and somebody I interview. But if you go to the dissenter.org and become a subscriber for $3 a month, $4 a month, and then I think it drops down to $3 if you become an annual subscriber. And if you go to the dissenter.org, become a subscriber, then you get access to all the exclusive content, the entire full episodes that we produce, and then any of the premium ones that we publish that are not for the public but are just for the community that we're building. And we recently moved to this place, moved from Patreon to this location. We're very grateful. Many people followed us over. Uh, at least half of the people who were at Patreon came over with us. Those people who are still over there, they might just be donating to us, or they may not want to have anything to do with our show anymore. But what we are doing is growing this independently from the Patreon platform, just so that we know that no matter what we do, nobody could ever censor us. Nobody could ever turn around and tell us that what we're putting out as far as this show goes is something that means we will be blocked from using the Patreon service. Not that that had ever happened, but we don't take any chances in this current climate. So that being said, thank you for tuning in to the show, and we'll be back next week with another episode.